Hi my trashies, I'm Finn of the recycling variety and it's been a while, but I'm back with a video and I'm feeling really pumped for this one. I did a bunch of research and I'm super excited to talk about this topic because it really matters to me why the US transportation system is messed up. Why it's so hard for me to exist without a car. So this is really important to me because I don't drive a car, and bad context, I do have a license. My parents forced me to get a license, but I never drive. I don't own my own car. Me and my partner are a one-car household, and she's the only one who actually drives. I never drive except the one time she sprained her ankle. I drove her to the ER so she could get that checked out. And that was the only time I've driven in the past, ever since I got my license. That was the only time I've ever driven. And obviously it's also a huge monetary, whatever. Cars, a lot of money. And I feel like we just accepted that it's normal in US society for us to have cars. And so I found it really difficult throughout my life, to get around places without a car. And I feel like I kind of took this for granted growing up because I grew up on Long Island, pretty close to New York City, and we have the LIR there, which is the Long Island Railroad, in case you didn't know. It's a pretty good railroad system that actually has consistent trains. The NYC, then I had the subway, I had the bus system. I just got really used to taking public transportation as a kid. And so it felt like a really big culture shock when I moved to other places and suddenly it's hard for me to get around. After college, I moved to California with my partner, and we moved, in the middle of California, and the town was literally super small, and it was, an hour to drive anywhere, and it was, in the middle of nowhere. Literally, you'd be driving through, mountains to get to anywhere, and yet nothing was walkable. Luckily, there was a CVS that was walkable down the way, but that was about it. When I moved to Arkansas with my partner, Arkansas is even worse. Obviously, there's no public transportation whatsoever there. We lived literally in the middle of nowhere, and it would be a 30-minute drive to my work. And so existing on a car there, really hard for me. And also just the fact that I want to walk my dog around so he can go to the bathroom, and a lot of these places aren't. Where I'm living right now in Massachusetts, I walk out and there's a main road, and there's no sidewalk on it or anything. And I'm so I'm going to walk my dog on a main road where it's supposed to be 30 miles per hour, but everyone goes 60 and acts like it's the highway, and I'm going to walk along there with my dog where there's no sidewalk. Yeah, sounds like I'm about to be a traffic incident. And then I don't think I need to get through cars' environmental issues, but just in case you weren't aware, the EPA says that transportation accounted for the largest portion of US cities' greenhouse gas emissions in 2022, which was 28%. Yeah, that's right, and most of that is cars. Yeah, that's bad. Just the fact that US infrastructure being so based around cars and driving also proportionally negatively affects lower income housing, because if you live in the suburbs, usually you live out in the suburb or somewhere out here if you want cheaper housing, because only people that can live in cities are people that are richer or people that don't mind living in small tiny apartments. I don't mind doing that, but I get it. You have family, you don't want to do that, so you go out to the suburbs, but you need a car. But then you need a job to afford a car because it's so expensive, and then you're kind of caught in this cycle where you're but to have a job, I need to have a car, and so you're kind of in debt to your car in a way. But so I did a bunch of research on this, basically trying to figure out the history of car dependency, and I'm is this always going to be this way? Am I just trapped, struggling my entire life trying to get around because I refuse to drive a car for personal reasons? And first I decided to figure out why it came about to be this way. So I went back through the history of cars throughout the US. And obviously, if you think about it, the US hasn't had cars for the majority of its history as a nation. It wasn't until 1885 when the first quadricycle was created, and that was the first ever gas-powered vehicle, but it was much more a bicycle that was powered on gas. Cars, even then, weren't widely built until into 1913. And if you think about it, that's a third of the nation's history. 2/3 was without cars. And so obviously before then, roads and everything were actually mainly used for walking. Even though carriages would go on them and horses too. Roads are mainly used for walking. And also something that I found really interesting, and there's kind of like, I don't want to say it's a conspiracy theory, but it kind of feels like one, about how like people pushed back against cars really heavily. In 1922, there was a parade during New York's Safety Week. The future marched with 10,000 children, and there was 1,054 of them who were like designated as a memorial division, who were supposed to represent all the kids that were killed in like car accidents that year. And there are reports of people would sprinkle nails and broken glass on the roads to stop people from driving their cars, and farmers would plow up the roads with their tractors. Like, it was intense. And it got to the point where people were recommending, if you drove a car, to bring a gun with you for your own personal protection. So people didn't really like cars at first. So I was like, so how did this happen? How did this happen? And that's where the conspiracy comes in. Because despite all these pushbacks, the car ownership grew really quickly. In 1900, there was only around like 8,000 cars. And by 1910, there was 458,000. And then by 1920, there was 8 million. We were basically cooked by then. Yeah. So now is where the conspiracy comes in. So a lot of people say that this happened because of people who lobbied for laws that would support the motor industry, and these people were all people that benefited financially from cars becoming the main mode of transportation, like automobile companies, people that put down cement on the roads. Like, they all basically, everyone joined together, and they even had a name. They're called Motordom. And Motordom came together and was like, we're going to lobby for protections to make there be more roads, make there be more cement roads, make it more possible for cars to become the main mode of transportation. There's this guy named Marin, and he was the president of the Portland Cement Association. So obviously he benefited a lot because, you know, cement makes asphalt roads. And he put out this engineering news record editorial and pushed to overhaul roads and prioritize automobile use as the main form of transportation. And people say that, and a bunch of other things in Motordom, the source of like, this is like political corruption stuff. When they talk about laws that really show that Motordom took over, they mainly point out the Federal Highway Act of 1956, which led to more investment in cars. But I feel like when I was looking into it, it's more complicated than that. Obviously, there's a lot of political factors that went into the large rise in cars and it then becoming the main mode of transportation in the US. But there was other factors as well. And so there was a lot of social factors and monetary factors. So the main monetary factors is the fact that during this time, people were moving out to the suburbs. And people were moving out to suburbs because it was the cheapest place to live if you didn't want to live in a small, tiny apartment with your family in a city. So you live in a small, tiny apartment with your family in a city, or you're super rich, you got a really big apartment. And so that kind of left the middle class in this, like, ebb and flow state in between, or they kind of were forced to move out into the suburbs where it was cheaper, but they could have more land, you know, more place for their families to live in. And so people were kind of forced to move into the suburbs, and that spurred car dependency for people because you can't really get around though in the suburbs because everything's so far laid out because everything's zoned for one family houses. So you kind of have to, you know, you kind of have to have a car. And so that really pushed car dependency in the US. And this is also partially kind of speculation based off of me. But originally cars were a rich person thing until the Model T came out, which is why we see the drastic jump by 1920 in car ownership, because cars were very expensive beforehand until Ford made the Model T, and then suddenly everyone had cars. And it was so bad that Woodrow Wilson made a speech worrying that bad motorists were increasing negativity towards rich people in 1910, which I find so funny. Sorry, that was 1908. Which I find so funny that he was like, I'm worried that like this is dividing the country, like these motorists. I feel whenever I read articles and people were talking about the people who rebelled, it was largely the lower classes, and so I felt part of it is like a social thing that they were rebelling against it, that they were like, cars suck, rich people suck, and then all of a sudden it became possible for them to own cars with the Model T, and all of a sudden it's like the dupe Gucci bags. It feels like that, where everyone's like, I want it for like the status symbol. So because it was owned first and kind of co-opted by rich people, I think it became a status symbol, kind of like Gucci. And then once it became possible for people in lower classes to have it, then they were like, oh, like it made them feel like they had increased their status by having one, even though they didn't really. Anyways, that's just like some speculation for me, but I feel like that happens a lot nowadays too with like, you know, dupes. So that's how cars became so popular in the US. And then, so nowadays we spend a lot on roads. In fact, in 2021, we spent $206 billion on roads. Yep, on fixing roads for cars. That is a lot of money. And despite that, 65% of roads are rated in less than good condition. So it feels like we're kind of dumping a lot of money in there and not getting a lot of return on investment. Today we don't spend a lot on public transportation, even though we used to obviously invest a lot more in public transportation, like before cars, trains were the primary mode of public transportation. In fact, half of the bridges in the Northeast Corridor that are used for trains are a century old, and then several tunnels in use for trains were done during the Civil War, which I find so crazy, and now it makes me more scared whenever I run on Amtrak. But despite all this, Amtrak ridership has increased by 50% from 1998 to 2014, which is a crazy amount. And so I want you to guess, in 2021, how much money the US spent on Amtrak, which is a nationwide railway service, as compared to roads, which they spent $206 billion on. That's right, they spent $5.3 billion. Yeah, that's like 2% of the budget that they spend on roads. And so it feels like, as someone that takes public transportation a lot, part of the reason why it's so bad is because the government doesn't invest enough into it. Like, I could talk about this forever, but the government isn't investing enough into it, so the trains don't run enough, the buses don't run enough, there's not enough routes stopping more frequently enough. And so because of that, people are like, I don't want to do that. And also, they're often slower than cars, and people prefer to take cars over public transportation. But obviously this creates an issue because there's low ridership on public transportation, and that continues because the government isn't investing enough money in it to make it more efficient, and so cars are more efficient, and so the government just invests more money in roads and maintaining those, and the cycle continues. You can see how the cycle continues and then there's continues to be low public transportation ridership because they're not investing any money, they're investing it all into roads, and so they see that low ridership, and so they continue to not invest enough money in public transportation. And it's a really bad cycle. So that's how we got to the point that we got up to here in 2025. Great. Yeah. Oh, also, I forgot to mention that there's also the fact that people act like public transportation is social welfare, and so that's why people don't want to invest in it. And I think that's just, I don't want to touch on it any longer because I feel like that's dumb. That's all I'm gonna say about that. Anyways, so that's how we got to where we are in 2025. And I feel like before I started researching this, and like why I find it so difficult to get literally anywhere without a car, like why is it so hard for me to get around, I didn't realize just how it's been so normalized that cars have such a high place in American society. And this has even been dubbed as a term. It's called motor normativity, that we've normalized cars. This really interesting study that people did that really made me think hard about it. So there was a study done showing how people are biased towards cars without realizing it. They gave people random surveys, and one of them was about cars, and the other one was about random things that could be comparable to cars. And people had to describe how much they agreed with the statement. Like, for example, the car statement would be, I don't think cars should be driven around high-density neighborhoods and expose people to fumes. And then the non-car statement would be, I don't think people should smoke around other people and expose people to the fumes. For the car statement, only 4% of people agree with that. But do you know how many people agree with the smoking statement? 97%. Even though they have pretty similar negatives to your health. And so I feel like that really hit me to show me just how normalized we made riding cars in our nation. And honestly, it was kind of scary. If you look at the statistics of how many people die from cars in car accidents, it's crazy, because every 13 seconds someone goes to the ER because of a car accident. And in the US, 4 people die every hour from a car accident. And I feel like we don't think about this too often, about the negative effects of cars and how much they affect people, because we've been so normalized by it. The amount of people that died last year from car accidents could fill a professional baseball stadium, and just how big that is when you go in. The fact that we could try to invest in public transportation to limit these deaths is crazy. And the fact that we're not doing it, and people don't have more outcry about cars and how much they hurt people and kill people, shows just how normalized it's been. We live in a world where cars are normal, and I don't like that. Also, there's the fact that cars are massively affecting our infrastructure in ways we don't think about, like how there's parking everywhere for cars, and so that takes up a lot of land use. It's just parking lots, and how so many places are required to have parking attached, which takes up more land use that people could use to have other stores. And then there's also the fact that a lot of America is zoned to have single family homes, and this makes them really spread out and continues the issue of people needing cars in the suburbs because everything's so spread out and it's not walkable and makes everything lower density. I don't want to go into that too much because it's depressing, but we just kind of normalized all these things, and I'm like, wow, that sucks. Yeah, I'm sure like at this point all this stuff is depressing me. And do you have some happy thoughts about cars in the US? And is there hope for public transportation ever? And my answer is yes. So I found a really hopeful note to end this on in one of the books that I was reading. They were talking about all of the more positive effects that have been happening with the US in the most recent years, trying to combat traffic, trying to combat public transportation issues, and things of that nature. First off, in 2015, MoCA, which I forget what I'm gonna put here what it's called, but it's an art gallery in LA, and they had an event titled Is Car Culture Dead? And there was a lot of people that came to it, and I feel like this really shows that I'm not the only one thinking about this. And this made me feel a lot better, because I was like, I'm not the only one who is like, can we stop driving cars? Can we move on from this? Like, is there a way to fix this? Like, since our infrastructure has been so messed up now that we also rely so heavily on cars, is there a way to fix this issue at this point? And so many people came. And then there was the fact that the 405 was shut down in LA for extra lanes to be added to fight congestion. I think this was in like 2019. And people assumed there would be a lot of accidents because people would be taking different routes, and that would add a lot of extra congestion to those routes, and people would be driving faster, angry driving because of extra congestion, extra traffic. So they were expecting there to be so much more accidents. But do you know what happened? Accidents went down so much. Instead, traffic went down, accidents went down because all the people just took ride shares and public transportation instead for that weekend. It really showed that making more roads, making bigger roads is not the answer to fighting traffic. And this kind of created a spur of a whole different bunch of changes in different cities throughout the US to make things more walkable friendly, more public transportation friendly. There's a lot of things that have happened in NYC. Like, as you probably know, Times Square was closed down to traffic now, and the street is just entirely walkable for several blocks. It's like 5 blocks or something. It's literally just for people walking. Cars aren't allowed to drive on it, and that also greatly reduced traffic, greatly reduced accidents, greatly reduced all of the all congestion, all the bad things. They also added bike lanes in places, Community Square in NYC. These actually reduced traffic and prevented accidents with a 50% reduction in congestion, and it shaved off like half the time of people driving through commutes who were driving through there. Obviously, also we have the congestion pricing that was added to NYC at the beginning of this year, which I know is controversial, but it has dropped the number of vehicles down by 11% in the first 6 months of congestion pricing. And even just that greatly going to affect your commute, and the amount of traffic that goes through places is going to further increase the use of public transportation. There's also been a huge rise in traffic circles, which also help to greatly reduce accidents and greatly reduce commute times as well, because you don't need to stop to wait at lights instead, at a 4-way instead of a 4-way lane. Instead of stops, you just go around in the circle, and because you're driving at slower speeds around the traffic circle, any accidents that do happen are less fatal usually, and they're not head-on collisions, as opposed to if you run a light and T-bone, you're both going at pretty high speeds. It's going to be a much more fatal accident. When I lived in Arkansas, that was one thing I saw. They were in love with traffic circles. I am also in love with traffic circles. In fact, there was one place where I was like, this needs to be a traffic circle now. And now whenever I go around places, I'm like, and that needs to be a traffic circle, and that needs to be a traffic circle, and that needs to be a traffic circle. All of these things are greatly improving infrastructure in the US, and reducing traffic and making public transportation more possible for people. I also just want to talk about briefly how I studied abroad in Italy for like a month, and it's really crazy when you compare how they treat roads as opposed to here. There was one town that I went in that was literally pretty much no one drove cars, and the roads were just for walking around this town. And it was amazing. It was incredible. I loved it so much because literally everything was walkable, no need for public transportation. And it really just made me think, this is how it used to be. And we could still fix things. We could still make things better, or at least greatly reduce the amount of traffic accidents, like greatly reduce the amount of people that need to use cars by making public transportation better, by implementing more public transportation. I'm sure you're like, yeah, but I can't do any of those things. Yeah, you can. But you can help by doing things like actually using public transportation if you have some in your area, and showing, you know, the government that people actually do want to use public transportation, and we want them to invest in public transportation more. We want them to invest in bike lanes more, and also lobbying for more things like traffic circles instead, so they can reduce traffic and also reduce accidents and make accidents less fatal. You can do so many things that you can lobby for in your neighborhood. But honestly, even just like doing more walking, doing more biking, doing more public transportation will help by itself, like even if you do those little things. I personally have gotten really into biking recently, and it's so freeing. It's so nice to be able to bike places, because I feel like a large problem of not having cars in the US is that you feel like you lose your independence. And biking, or even walking in certain areas, or having good public transportation really opens up that independence that people can have again. I think that's it for me. That was just my little chat, kind of brain dump about everything I found out about why it's so hard for me to exist in the US without a car, how we got here infrastructure-wise, and hopefully that ending made you feel a little bit better, though, after a bunch of the depressing stuff about how cars have been affecting us. If you liked this video, you're supposed to like it down below, and feel free to subscribe and or comment and tell me your opinions about public transportation in the US or wherever you live, what it's like, and whether you have a car. If you liked this, feel free to subscribe and tune in for the next video where I talk about the next random brain dump that I have in my brain. Yeah. Anyways, thanks for watching, my trashies. I'll see you next time. This has been Finn of the Recycling Variety. Bye!